I didn't 100% plan for today. I know you're all grateful to hear that. Like, gee, thank you. But not because I didn't have something to bring, but because I felt like maybe we could just cover some bases and then do some interactive stuff. And I will base the next 2 weeks off of that. I hope that makes sense. And so rather than me preparing a series for you that you must listen to, I'm going to give you some information today, and then we're going to have some Q&A. And during the Q&A, I'm just going to give some preliminary responses, and I'm going to write some things down, and then I'm going to go home and compile based on what we talk about today. Is that cool? Okay, good. Because I've found that one of my biggest problems with Western Christendom and Eastern Christendom, really, because they're all the same, is that it's all about the dude up front getting to do everything. And it's not that it's bad. We need teachers, and we need an environment for learning and growth, and we need an environment for community and all that, and that's fine. But I just think for me, I'd rather do it in a communal way. So I think what I want to do today a little bit is just kind of lay some groundwork for how to read the Bible. I know that sounds fun. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that, I used to do the whole, and I mean, you guys know this, I preached here enough and you've heard it, but I used to do the whole, like, almost throw out the Bible kind of shtick, where it's like, oh, there's parts of it you don't need, and there's parts of it you can just ignore. And even though I still kind of feel like that, it's a little more founded now, and it's not based in throwing it out, but based in understanding what's going on. And so I think that if I could summarize it, what I'm working toward is helping people to read the Hebrew Bible, which is our Old Testament, without fear and trembling. Meaning it's okay, like there's a lot of stuff back there that we just don't like to deal with. And the mental gymnastics required to get by some of that stuff has caused a lot of problem in the church and in people's lives because they try to apologize for God, essentially. And instead of just allowing the Bible to say what it says, and it might be awkward, and it might be confrontational to the way we believe now. This is hard for some people to grasp, right? That not only does the Bible not harmonize with itself, it doesn't harmonize with our current theological stance on things. We find our points there, yes, but there's always going to be something that disagrees. And this is why we've got 40,000 Protestant denominations, and which broke off from Catholicism, which broke off from Eastern Orthodoxy. And it's why we have all these breaking points, is that everybody thinks, oh, well, where we've arrived right now is the telos of the Bible. Like, it's where the Bible was pointing all along. No, that's stupid. But we do it because we get real impressed with where we've landed. And it's like, oh, well, how come this doesn't this and that doesn't that? And if you really look at the Hebrew prophets, they're all about justice. And, well, that's true. There's water leaking. They are all about justice, but they're also about things like racial purity and, like, not intermarrying. And so there's a lot of things there that we got to be careful of appropriating into our culture today and acting like my current theological position is the one that's the overarching position of the Bible. Now, that's a lot, but that's kind of where I went and why I disappeared for about 3 years, is that I started looking at things and I started reading and actually reading and learning Hebrew and looking into Greek and looking into Aramaic and deciding, okay, well, what we teach right now is a lot of apologies for why the Bible doesn't agree with our current theology. And that, I did a lot. I have a whole series based on why the Bible doesn't agree with my current theology and why my current theology is right. And that's a funny place to be for Christians. And I say every once in a while, but when I get a chance to talk, like, did God really say, probably isn't the best place to start discussions of Christian theology. Because that's kind of like, it's there, right? Did God really say? That's a problem in the beginning. And so rather than did God really say, what we need to say is, okay, why does the Bible say what it says? And I think that's a much better point to launch from when we're in discussions about the Bible. And whether or not, I mean, I don't know, and I won't do a show of hands because we do a pretty good job in this church of being integrated with people who don't believe the same way as us. But some of us might still hold to something like inerrancy with the Bible, some of us don't. And that's fine. Because I don't think that anything that I'm about to go into necessarily messes with inerrancy if it's framed correctly. And what I mean by that is, inerrancy just kind of means there's no errors. Okay, and I tend to reframe it and say there's no intentional lies. Okay, and so even though there might be historical data that's off, there might be geographical data that's off, there might be outright polemic that is made up, there might be mythology. Nothing in the text is written to be a lie. Okay? And so that's kind of where I sit with it. That doesn't mean that I haven't found things that the archaeological record doesn't agree with. You know, we have a pretty good archaeological record right now, and there's some things that aren't touched, and then there's some things that are very clearly disrupted by archaeology with what the Bible says. And how we deal with that is kind of where I'm sitting now. Is what do we do with things that a lot of people call like troublesome texts? You know, and most of those troublesome texts are in the Old Testament. Some of them are in the New Testament. But the majority are in the Old. And the troublesome texts are where people disconnect from God in the Bible. Oh, well, you know, if God didn't, you know, he killed babies. He did this. He commanded them to kill babies. And it's like, all of that is still insisting on a weird reading of the Bible that the Bible doesn't insist on itself. You know, it's never once does the Bible say everything that's in here is literal and you should read it as such. You know, never once does it say everything that's in here is narrative and you should read it as such. You know, there's poetry, there's music, there's narrative, there's fiction, there's mythology. There's anti-mythology, you know, there's all kinds of different literary genres. There's polemic, there's propaganda. And it's there because we're dealing with ancient Israel. And it's an ancient group of people. And they don't exist as an island. They live in a culture. And they live in a portion of the world that we now call the Near East or the ancient Near East or the Middle East or however we want to frame that and not be offensive. And I don't mean that like funny. I just mean it's odd where we've decided and demarcated like West and East. And I think that tends to be so that we can other the East as Westerners and so that the East can other us. And it's silly to me. You go far enough east, you just kind of hit everything, and same if you go west. So everybody's a Westerner to somebody. You know. But that said, I tend to think that what we've done is we've romanticized a bit of what's going on, especially in the Old Testament. And we've said, oh, this is all about me. And it's like, no, not really. You know, and if we're Christians, the telos, the end point of all this is Jesus. And if we're not, the telos is still something like a Messiah or the restoration of Israel, and it's, you know, so it's not that we would disagree with Jews. The telos of the Old Testament is the restoration of Israel. It's just that we believe that happened in Jesus. Okay, and so it's when we start to really address this stuff, we don't really get to say chuck it. Or we can say shelve it, which I do a lot. There's a lot of things that I'm like, I don't know why it says that. You know, there's nothing that can deal with that in my like little go-to bag of tricks, and so let's just leave it for now and shelve it. But shelving is different than chucking. You know, when we shelve something, we keep it for later. So, and I tend to think that some of the more troublesome things that like people really have a problem with come in the first few books. And Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, Chronicles, right? Like most of us, when we've got issues with the Bible and issues with the Old Testament and issues with how God acts, it comes in the stories of those books. Okay, I mean, there's other things that we can deal with, and there's some weird stuff that happens in Ezekiel, and that's fine. But generally speaking, and like the new atheist claims against Christianity, right? Or, hey, boys, are all kind of based in a literal reading of a small portion of the Bible. And everything that's like offensive is found in those books, and it's like, well, what if we actually learn how to read it? Instead of just coming in and assuming, okay, well, Genesis 1 is the creation of the earth. Why don't we come in and assume nothing, and just see what it has to say? Okay, and so what I'll do, I think I want to read Genesis 1. And kind of just point out some things. And this is a good exercise in learning to not only read the Bible, but to read the Bible critically. And to learn to look beyond just the typical. I mean, I picked Genesis 1 because we all know the story. Okay, it's not one that I think any of us really need to go okay, let's have 5 minutes and read it so we're familiar. We get it. So, let me get this open real quick. Okay. Martin Luther said that reading the Bible in translation is like kissing your bride through a veil. And so one of the things we have to understand, and I think everybody here is versed enough in this, but is that anything done in translation will always have something lost. Okay, and anybody that speaks more than one language knows that. Even from English to Spanish, you lose something. And idioms don't pass over the same way. And especially idioms, they're weird. Like Afrikaans idioms are strange. Like the way that they come over to English doesn't make any sense, and they wouldn't make any sense, and it's just an idiom in Afrikaans. And my wife will use them sometimes, and I'm like, what? But that's just how it is. And when you put it in, so when we translate things, something is always lost in translation, but a good translation will tell you, hey, there's some ambiguity here, or it can be taken this way or that way. And so that's why I always recommend people get a good, in addition to your everyday Bible that you read, get something like the Oxford Annotated NRSV, because it's a big, thick one. It's kind of a scholarly Bible, but they give footnotes, and there's a lot of them. And it's like, hey, there are translation issues in some of these words, and there's ambiguity in some of it. And then there's also explanations as to why certain words are the way they are, and why manuscripts have them and some others don't. And so it's just a good way to get into really diving in. So I'm just going to read Genesis 1 through 2-3, and I'm going to just kind of along the way bring out some things that I think are important into how we even read the English text, okay? So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Okay, so if God created the heaven and the earth in the beginning, what are the waters that it was hovering over, that the Spirit is hovering over? Okay, it doesn't say God created the waters. It says God created the heaven and the earth, and the waters haven't been made yet. Right? We'll find this later on, but down here in I think it's the third or fourth day is when God creates the water. So what are these waters that God's Spirit is hovering over? Okay? And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God caused there to be a separation between the light and between the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Okay, and we haven't gone into 24-hour days yet either, so the first day is what? They don't know. And God said, "Let there be a vaulted dome in the midst of the waters." Again, waters haven't been created yet. So why is there a vaulted dome in the midst of the waters? Let it cause a separation between the waters. So God made the vaulted dome, and he caused a separation between the waters which were under the vaulted dome and between the waters which were over the vaulted dome, and it was so. And so here's we get into a little bit of Israelite cosmology, right? They believe that there are waters above and waters beneath, okay, and that God has separated those, okay? And God called the vaulted dome heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. And God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered into one place. So were the waters gathered or not? Because he already put them in one place and separated them. And now he's saying, let the waters below be gathered again into one place. And all this is just in 8 verses so far. And let the dry ground appear. And it was so. So God created the heavens and the earth, but there was no dry ground yet. And it was so, and God called the dry ground earth, and he called the collection of waters seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth produce green plants that will bear seed, fruit trees bearing fruit in which there is seed according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth green plants bearing seed according to its kind, and trees bearing fruit. Now I'll get into that later. In which there was seed according to its kind, and God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, a third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vaulted dome of heaven. I thought he already created light. Let there be lights in the vaulted dome of heaven to separate day from night. Didn't he already do this? Why is he doing it again? And let them be as signs and for appointed times and for days and years. And again, this is, like, for anybody that's got a real religious problem with astrology, I don't care what you believe there, but right in Genesis 1, it does say that the stars are given for days and appointed seasons and times. And so it's not so far-fetched, okay? And they shall be as lights in the vaulted dome of heaven to give light on the earth, and it was so. Now, do we have lights that give light on the earth? No, we have a light. Only the sun is enough to actually light the earth. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the smaller light to rule the night. Does a smaller light rule the night? No, the moon is a reflection of the sun. Okay, so it's not 2 lights, it's 1 light. And God placed them in the vaulted dome of heaven to give light on the earth and to rule over the day and over the night and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a 4th day. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly over the earth across the face of the vaulted dome of heaven. So here, if we read this really critically, it actually doesn't say that God created the living creatures. It says that they came out of the waters. So again, like, evolutionary theory doesn't seem so far off if you just read it for what it actually says. Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and that's fine. And that's what, I don't know where I stand on all that, honestly. I'm okay with accepting it because of that. It's like, it does just say, let the waters abound with an abundance of creatures. It doesn't, God doesn't go through and individually name and create each one, right? So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm according to their kind, and every bird with wings according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a 5th day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind. So the earth is bringing forth the creatures. God isn't necessarily individually creating each of them, if we're reading this just kind of critically. Even though it says he did, he says, let the earth bring forth. So again, we've got some disagreement in the same story. Okay, and we've already seen some of this. So cattle and moving things and wild animals according to their kind, and it was so. So God made wild animals according to their kind, and the cattle according to their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. And God said, and here I'm going to take a little aside to deal with something that Dad and I have talked about, and he doesn't disagree with me, and so you don't have to either. And God said, let us make humankind in our image and according to our likeness. Now, we have heard this taught, that this is the Trinity speaking in Genesis, that because they use the word us and our, that we have plurality in the Godhead, and so this is our good Trinitarian foundation, and that's just absolutely wrong. The reason they say, let us make man in our image, is because the word God in Hebrew is Elohim, and Elohim is plural. Okay, so they're just being grammatical. And since an Elohim is talking, he says, let us, plural, because Elohim is plural. Okay, so we get this a little bit too with the sheification of the Spirit. When we say the Holy Spirit is a she, and it's silly because grammatical gender does not equal physical gender or sex. And grammatical gender in languages that have it is just a way they identify words and make the verbs match. And in Spanish, when you say you're going to the library, you're going to la biblioteca, which is a feminine noun. So you're not going to a woman, or you're not going to she, you're going to the library. It's just the library. So the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit, not she, not he. I think that when they take it either way, they're doing it wrong. And we can say the same thing about God. I am not a man that I should, and then that by that same token you can say I am not a woman. God is not a sexed being. Okay, and the Holy Spirit is not a sexed being. And so he, she doesn't really work in that world. I know that we're all wrapped into all that because we see he throughout the Old Testament, and it's because Yahweh's masculine, and because Elohim is masculine. And because every deity, well, not every, there's a lot of feminine deities too. So it's the particular deity is masculine. Okay, but as we understand God in our theology, God is neither male nor female. And I think we all get that. Except for those of us that worship Jesus, and in that case we say he. And that's not a statement of exclusion of the other. What that is a statement of, I actually worship a human. And he was a male. And so I don't have an issue with that. People say he about Buddha. So God created humankind in his image. Oh, let me get back into this. God said, let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of heaven and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that moves upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the likeness of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So when you look at this, it's not two beings that have been created. It is the Adam. And we transliterate that and say Adam, but in Genesis 1, it is the Adam. Okay, that is created. And the Adam is created male and female. So if we're going to insist, like many do, on a flat literal reading of the text, then we have to say that in the beginning, something like an intersex being was made. I mean, there's just no way around it, at least in Genesis 1. So I think, again, we'll get into some of this here when we talk about the scholarly side of all this. But and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of heaven and over every animal that moves upon the earth. And Baxter likes to say the first commands of God are sex and fishing. And God said, look, I am giving you every plant that bears seed, which is on the face of the whole earth, and every kind of tree that bears fruit. They shall be yours as food. There are lots of plants that bear seeds that we throw people in prison for now. And I'm not trying to be like a drug apologist. I'm just saying. Like if we're going to be flat, literal readers of the Bible, then we have absolutely no right to form laws around plants that bear seeds. Okay? So you can tell how intellectually dishonest we tend to read things. And to every kind of animal of the earth, and to every bird of heaven, and to everything that moves upon the earth in which there is life, I am giving every green plant as food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a sixth day. And heaven and earth and all their array were finished. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done and rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. Now, notice it doesn't say that God didn't work on the seventh day. He finished his work on the seventh day. And then he rested. So this idea that the seventh day is a day strictly of rest is actually not there. He finished his work on the seventh day, and then he rested, also on the seventh day. Okay, so don't let those Seventh-day Adventists pin you down. You can do a little bit of work, but you better rest. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work of creating that there was to do. Okay. And we all know that Genesis 2:4 goes on with a second creation story, right? And just for fun, what you could do this week, if you want to do some homework, oh boy, is you could go and read Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, and you could write down on a piece of paper all the things that God creates, when God makes them, what order they're in, what day they're on, and how they're created, like I said, with the Adam, male and female, right? And then go to Genesis 2 and note that absolutely none of it matches. Things are in different orders. God creates man and then pulls woman out of him. I mean, it's totally different, okay? So again, right away, we've got this disagreement in the first two chapters of the Bible. And that's why, like, anybody that still goes with this harmonizing thing with the Bible, I'm like, you obviously have never even read it. Because in the first chapter, it disagrees with itself. Oh, he created the light, but then he also created more light, and then he did it again. It's like, well, which one is it? Did he create the earth here or there? Did he do the waters here or there? You know, which is it? Well, this is a really easy, troublesome text because we don't have God being a divine executioner. We just have God creating. So it's easier for us, but it is still a troublesome text. Sorry about the heat. Excel turned the gas off this week for a repair thing, and we haven't had time to get back on yet. So there's no heat right now. Sorry. Okay, so but what if we take Genesis 1 and we pick it apart? And this is where I think we can start getting a little more active. So if you have any questions while we're going through any of this, please throw your hand up, and I'll try to repeat it for the people who are online. And like I said, I'll give preliminary responses, not answers, because I have too much data at home to go through if I really want to give an answer. So I need to be more prepared. But I think as we go through this, we can start to see some things about how to handle these troublesome texts and how we can go and actually become a student of the Bible rather than just a reader. Okay, and I don't think that everybody should have to be a student of the Bible in order to be a Christian. By no stretch. I think that everybody who wants to discuss the Bible and wants to read it devotionally should probably become a student of the Bible. I mean, if you don't know what it says, it's kind of hard to discuss it. So that's kind of where I sit. So don't ever take me saying, well, reading the Bible in translation is like kissing your bride through a veil. That's not elitist. That just means it's written in Hebrew. You know, and it's written in Greek, and it's written in Aramaic. And things get lost in translation. And I used to be on the side who would think that translators were incredibly biased. I don't so much think so anymore. I used to. And there are a couple Bibles that just flat out admit up front, hey, our theological direction is here, and we import that into the text. And at least they're honest. So you know ahead of time, but read the introductions to your Bibles if you have them, and see what the translation team is doing and why they're doing the Bible they're doing. You know, sometimes there's a reason they pick certain translation than other translations. It's like, and it's not always because they disagree with grace people. I mean, we do that, right? Like it's, the evil translator. Well, the first writers of the Bible were evil translators because they put Jesus from Aramaic into Greek. I mean, of the New Testament. Right? So he spoke Aramaic. He didn't speak Greek. So everything we read of Jesus is already in translation. except for a couple things which they keep in Aramaic, but nothing else for some reason. So I think those might be important to kind of look at. But let's go through Genesis 1 and bring out some things as to the whys and hows that they wrote what they wrote. Okay? And if I misstate this, I'll clear it up next week. But from what I recall, most scholars believe that Genesis 1 is the older of the two creation stories. And the reason they believe this, it usually lines up to be something along the lines of the longer text is almost always a commentary on the shorter. Okay, so that's just kind of how it works. We still do that today, right? Like the Bible's just like a book, like it's thin. I mean, it's got a few pages, but it's not a volume, right? Like an anthology of books, even though it is, but it's small, and then we write books on it, and I mean, come on, they're endless. I've got like 40,000 books in my PDF library on my computer, and that's not even scratching the surface of biblical studies. It's like, there's just hundreds of thousands of things written about the Bible. Okay, and these are all later. Well, duh. And it kind of applies with the biblical text too. If you got a place where you've got two stories that match, or at least are kind of the same, typically, not always, but typically the shorter one is the older one. Okay? So that means that for Genesis 1, there's something here that Israel held on to, and it could be Northern Kingdom Israel, is kind of what I tend to think, because they're older than Southern Kingdom Judah. Again, there's going to be people who disagree with me, but they don't watch our broadcast, so I really don't care. So Genesis is widely acknowledged to have been mostly put down, compiled, written, edited, whatever we want to call that, after the Babylonian exile. Okay, so that's a long time after all this. And what does that do to our questions of Moses' authorship of all this? I don't know. But there's language here that we're going to go into that prevents us from acknowledging that the story as it exists right now was old. Older than the Babylonian exile. That's pretty old. It's like 2,800 years ago, something like that. But older than that, right? Okay, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, tohu vabohu, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the deep is the word tehum in Hebrew. And tehum is the Hebrew, I think that's right, the Hebrew cognate version, or a form, however we want to say it, of the Babylonian god Tiamat, okay, who in their creation story is blown open and violently and split open, and out of her carcass, Tiamat's a she, right? My teacher's going to be smacking his head. And through that violence and exploded carcass of chaos comes creation. Okay, and this is virtually every creation narrative has chaotic waters. It's the yin and yang in Buddhist and Zen philosophy. That's chaos, right? It's swirling. And in Greek mythology, there was chaos at the beginning, and cosmos is the opposite of chaos. It's ordered creation coming out of chaotic nothingness. Okay, well, in this story of the Babylonian story, it's the god Marduk, I believe, that splits Tiamat open, and he wins the day. Right? He does it violently. And here, the Spirit of God is hovering peacefully over the deep. Over to whom? Over this God. So it's not this violent, tear open bloodfest. There's chaos, but God's Spirit decides to hover over it and bring peace to the chaos, and out of that begin creation. Okay, and so right away we see just by verse 2, they're already counteracting Babylonian mythology. Okay, it doesn't speak so directly to Babylonian mythology because they wrote it 10,000 years ago. It speaks to it because they're currently being held captive. And so they know their captors' mythologies, and they're upsetting their captors' mythologies by placing their God at the top of the stories of these other, well, at this time, of Babylon. And saying, well, whatever, it's our God. And then there's also some difference to how it happens. Okay? And I know we tend to think that, oh, well, this God is the only God who speaks creation. All the other gods, like there's stories of sex in creation. In Egypt, one of the gods self-pollinates, we'll put it that way. There is violence, there is chaos, there is bloodshed, and only in Israel, well, not really, because they're actually in Memphite theology, which is from Egypt. Memphis is a city in Egypt. And in their theology, they actually said that their god Ptah spoke creation into existence. So Israel doesn't hold the market on that, but it does kind of harken back to they knew this from somewhere. Okay? And so what they're doing is they're saying, hey, look, we don't necessarily know that you're wrong. We just know that there's this God is the right God, So that's just verse 2. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, light be is probably more accurate. And meaning, the way this is framed is when God says something, it becomes. So more like light, and all of a sudden, there's light. In Hebrew, it's or is the word. And so all God says is or, and or creates light. Okay, does that make sense? He's not creating something and then naming it. He's speaking it, and therefore it is. Okay? And that all speaks to who he says he is later. I am what I say I am, right? Okay. And then when God creates here, this word created is bara in Hebrew, and it's only used of God in the Old Testament. So when human beings make something, they asa it, they make it, they fashion it out of something else. But bara is God's making something out of, no, not out of nothing. Because creation ex nihilo is wrong. Because what exists when God is there? This isn't a trick question. It's actually really easy. God. So then what is God creating out of? God. So then creation is coming from God, not from nothing. And that's a big distinction. Because that is what gets us in this position where the deepest truth about me is nothing. Or the deepest truth about me is that I was fashioned from God. God creating out of God's self. And we can be poetic like Brad and Baxter and talk about other-centered, self-giving love, and that's Trinitarian theology. But right here, God is just creating, and God is not creating out of nothing. He's pulling from within God's self, and creating this stuff and saying light. God is light. We know this. This is in the text, right? And he says earth. Okay? So then God sees the light and says that it is good. And even though it's good, he causes a separation. So it's obviously not perfect. And there is a word for perfect in Hebrew, and they just don't use it. It's good, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. Just because he caused the separation. It's good, but we could also do this with it. So then by the end of verse 5, we're getting to what the point of all this is, right? Is the point of all this that God literally, in the first day, created all these things and created day and created night? No. The point is that we have day and night now. So here's how we got there. So does that make sense? It's less about here's what actually happened, and it's more about, well, we know where we are now. And so here's how we think we got here. And the way I typically like to relate this is, how many of you still remember way back in school, some of us might remember better than others, when you were taught about the Grand Canyon being formed by Paul Bunyan's blue ox Babe dragging an axe down, right? I remember these stories, right? Or like the Northern Lights are Paul and Babe wrestling up in Alaska, and they're poof, and you get the Northern Lights, right? Well, total tall tales, but we have a Grand Canyon and Northern Lights. So are they lies? No. They're just how, before we became so scientific and data-driven, we used to think of things in a little bit more like amazing terms. Like, well, this couldn't have just been done by water eroding over millions of years. How boring. It had to be someone with a 90-foot blue ox. Yeah, that's better. And you know what? Everyone knows the Grand Canyon because of those stories when they grew up. And so everyone knows that, okay, we see all this stuff around us, it's because God did it. It's not meant to say, here's how he did it. It's meant to say that he did it. Okay? And in the meantime, they're also telling other stories. And so each of these verses gets a little like, it plays a little bit with where they are, but it also plays a little bit with where they think it all began. And so there's more than just the flat reading that we like to give it. God said, let there be a vaulted dome in the midst of the waters, and let it cause a separation between the waters. And again, this relates back to Israel's cosmology and how they believed. And they believed that the earth was a flat thing on pillars. And that above these pillars was a dome, and it's blue, so it must be water. And then that means that since above us is a dome, which is a rounded object, flat earthers, I'm just joking, that must mean that there's also one below. And so Sheol is below, right? It's actually under. It's not about like center of the earth, it's about under, like below it. Okay, and so when we start to, like, these are words that we need to take note of. The little words mean a lot, and so when Psalm says, who is man that you are mindful of him? You have made him a little lower than Elohim. And however you take that, traditional Jewish writing takes it as angels because angels are Elohim. A lot of modern scholars and some early church scholars take that as God because Elohim can also be God. But either way, it's not meaning hierarchically. It's meaning cosmologically. You're actually lower than God is. Or the angels, because they exist in realms above you. Okay? Who is man that you are mindful of him? There are other realms that you should be caring about, but you care about the one that is actually literally beneath you. It's like it's down here and you care. Why? What shouldn't you be concerned with all of this? With the whole created order rather than just this, which is beneath you, right? So, again, this is how we learn to read it a little more critically, and can it be presented hierarchically? Sure, it can, because of Jesus. And we can get there with Christian theology, but again, just because our theology is here now does not mean that that's what they meant, okay? So God makes this vaulted dome, causes a separation between the waters, and then he calls one of them the heavens, not heaven, because it's whatever. I'm just trying to get to some more stuff that matters. Not that none of this is important, but I want to for the sake of time. Well, okay, let's just do this. So verses 10 to 12, 11 and 12, bring out the trees. There is good that every tree bears fruit, every plant that bears seed is good for food. Every, right? So where do the two come from in the next chapter? That one of them is not good for food. Oh, wait, I changed my mind. No, actually, one's not good for food. Even though I said everything was, one of them isn't. But good news, I put them both in the middle of the garden right next to each other so that you wouldn't be tempted and you would know. Wait. Does that ever work with your kids? Hey guys, we bought cake for dinner, but I just it's already cut and on the table, but don't eat it yet. Yeah, right. Yeah. I'm like, hey guys, we have cupcakes for your birthday. Please don't put your fingers in them. Yeah. And there's 5 different size handprints in the cupcakes at my house. Which one of you? I caught you brown-handed. So the earth brought forth these green plants and seed, bearing seed according to their kind, and they brought forth fruit according to its kind, and God said that it was good, and he didn't say except for that one. And then there's the end of the third day. So again, what are we doing with the tree in the second chapter of Genesis? Why is it there? Etiological. It's them trying to, why is there sin? Why do we see things around us? Why does man have to labor? Why does he have to toil in a field like a farmer? So that tells you where they are in history, right? They're past the pastoral stage of being shepherds, and they're actually working the fields, being agricultural. And we kind of know when this happens in human anthropology and when, around what time this is taking place. So this story is at least from that time, when they're already working fields and not taking care of sheep. Otherwise, the fall would have been something like, you have to care for the animals that are out in the desert. Instead of you're going to toil in the soil. Well, that dates us a little bit. Sorry. And then again, like I said, verse 14 actually gives us a little bit of footing for the people who want to hope in astrology and to say that the stars can tell us things. I don't care what you do with that. I've learned that God is not confined to talking to us in ways that 2018 charismatics approve of. And I've become more and more comfortable with God meeting people that are outside of our own tradition and out of our own stories and stuff. And so when someone like Siddhartha Gautama, who's the Buddha, meditates 1,000 years before Jesus, is out seeking an end to human suffering and is meditating, I believe he met God. I don't, the religions we erect around the people who meet God are silly. But that doesn't mean that people didn't meet God. Okay? And that's even the religion we've erected around the person who is God. For Christians, the religion is silly. Christianity is a silly religion. It really is. Now we can make beautiful things of it, but the point is that God became man. That's really what we say. And everything else after that is religion. It's the practice of how we worship and follow, and that's why there's so much. So with Buddha, do people meet God who are outside the Jewish tradition 1,000 years before Jesus? Do they? How privileged do we have to think we are? To think that, oh no, it has to come through this, that, or the other thing that matches my own personal tradition. Anyways. Exactly. How does a guy who's a pagan, polytheistic worshiper of many gods meet God? He did, and we love the story, and it's 3 major religions are based around this story, and he was neither one of those. He wasn't a Christian by any means. Sure, no, couldn't have been. He also wasn't a Jew, because Judaism didn't exist yet. Probably something like Zoroastrian, at least partially, and he met God. And we based a religion around him. Okay? So what I'm not saying is all religions are the same. What I am saying is I genuinely believe that anyone at any time can and has met God. Have they seen him accurately? Probably not. I think that's where John is correct. No one has seen God at any time, meaning accurately perceived. No one has gotten the full picture because we can't handle it, Okay. And God keeps seeing that things are good. He doesn't say that they're good, he sees that they're good. Sometimes. Kind of depends. There's probably something in that, like a sermon, but I'm not going to worry about it. Let's go to verse... Well, let's just do 20 and 21. God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly over the earth across the face of the vaulted dome of heaven." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kind, and every bird with wings according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And so, again, etiological. Why do we have great sea beasts that we don't know about? I don't know, God must have done it. This isn't saying, and so what God did was he allowed them to evolve over billions of years, and it's also not saying that he didn't do that. We're not getting a detailed plan of creation. We're getting, God was there and a bunch of stuff happened. And now we have all this stuff, trees and animals and birds and. And God says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas," even though the seas were already swarming. "And let the birds multiply on the earth," even though the skies were already swarming. And then we get down to... Yeah, I've already brought it out on the plant thing, but in verse 29, God says to the Adam and to the birds of the sea, the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every animal that moves upon the earth. And then God says to them that he's giving them all the plants as food. So he's already called everything good and already said it's all for food, and then he says to them it's all for food. So the animals can eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, but people can't, at least if we're going to follow it through to Genesis 2. And that's where we'll quit on this little, because the rest of it I've already talked about. So again, then we go into Genesis 2, you've got all this stuff that disagrees with that. Like I said, do some work this week and just put them together and read them next to each other. And then you'll find that in Genesis 2, you've got things like the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and if they say eastward, that means they're where? Westward. And if they say something like, "For this reason a man shall leave his mother and father," and that's coming from the first created man who didn't have a mother and father, then you know that this is probably written later. And if they say something like, "The two shall become one flesh," and he's at least hinting at a marriage ceremony, you know again that this at least has like a priestly hand in it when marriage was a thing. Because in the garden there's no such thing as marriage because there's no other women. It's like you're in a committed relationship whether you like it or not. Get over it. God created the first common law couple. Right? And then, so we look at this stuff and I think we tend to just like breeze right over it. And we don't like, oh, wait. If it's in the beginning and they're talking about marriage, chances are that this is later on that someone is writing. And if it's later on that someone is writing, there's probably an agenda to why they're writing what they're writing. And that, the agenda is the big question. Okay, why did they say what they said? And sometimes we can be very comfortable and say, well, the archaeological record says. So, and the one I'll use frequently is Joshua in the Battle of Ai. Okay, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Battle of Ai did not happen within about 1,300 years of when Joshua is supposed to have existed. The city had been destroyed a long time. It was probably nothing but a ghost town when they happened upon it. And surprise, surprise, Joshua overcame it. Well, duh. It's a ghost town. But the layer data in the archaeology doesn't back up the fact that there was ever a battle there at the time of Joshua. Okay? It just wasn't. So why did they write that they had destroyed it? Probably propaganda. Okay? Again, the why is a question. Maybe they did it because, well, we found this destroyed city. How did it happen? Oh, maybe one of our forefathers, you know that Joshua guy that killed all those Canaanites? Maybe he was involved in that. You know? And we begin to see that really what they're doing a lot of times is they're explaining why things are the way they are. And this goes all the way forward to like books like Ezekiel, where the why things are the way they are is way more vulgar. And it's like, hey, God's judging you because you've been disgusting in his temple. You know, and so we like to call these books prophetic books, but I tend to think they're more explanatory books. Right? Like, well, here's why that happened to you. And it tends to be like there are just things that are said in a lot of the prophetic books that aren't said unless you have hard data in front of you. And they're said in retrospect. Okay? And as disgusting as it sounds, someone like Jerry Falwell Sr. before he died, who said, oh, Hurricane Katrina was God's judgment against the gays in New Orleans. You know, that's him actually playing a good biblical prophet. Meaning, he looked at the situation and he determined, well, this is the judgment of God. And this is what the biblical prophets did. Oh, well, God is sovereign, so if you're one of his chosen people and you got destroyed, he must have been judging you. And here's why. Let me give you a 12-chapter prophecy as to why. And usually what it relates to is one of two things. It relates to not caring for the stranger and the orphan, or it relates to the worship of other deities. Okay, and so with Babylon, most of Israel that was left believed that they were being punished for their forefathers having worshipped other deities at the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. Okay, and so Ezekiel actually like really chastises them and says, you know, you played the harlot with golden phalluses at the altar of Yahweh. And this is why the language of Ezekiel is so sexual, because they did this. And he's like, when he says you played the harlot, they literally played the harlot. I mean, this is how they were worshiping other deities, like in Yahweh's temple. And so Ezekiel says, man, you've been destroyed, and here's why, because you were being disgusting. You know, and part of why Ezekiel's vision of the restored temple includes eunuchs who are sexless is because of the gross sexual misconduct happening at the temple of Yahweh at the time. Okay? And so when we start to look at this stuff, you know, that little aside on Ezekiel might help you, because all of a sudden it's not like, well, why is God so like furious in Ezekiel? It's more, how is Ezekiel framing what's happened? And it gives you insight into what's been going on in Israel. Okay? And so with this whole Genesis 1 and 2 thing, you know, for me, this is easy, because this is, when you start to look at other cultures' mythologies, it's very easy to see what Israel's doing. You know, and they're using other mythologies that they know, and they're putting Yahweh at the top of those mythologies and saying, his name is the name above any other name. You know, it's him. Your story might be right. We're going to tweak it a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's because it's Yahweh, not your God. Okay? And I think if we can get hold of that, especially in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, we can understand a bit about what the New Testament writers are doing, because a lot of times the New Testament writers are not trying to write biographical history about Jesus. They're trying to take their known stories where Yahweh used to be at the helm, and they put Jesus there. So they're carrying on a long tradition, doing what they do. This is how they say, we don't know about all this, but we do know that this is God. And so, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth becomes, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, you know, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that's not like some spoken word. That's not like, oh, the word Jesus existed at the beginning before the character Jesus existed in history. No, that's silly. What it means is, whatever we say about the beginning, in the beginning was this guy that we call the Word. right? So they're saying Jesus is God. It's a really long literary way for them to assert his divinity without just outright saying he's God. Because do you think that first century Jewish people are going to listen to someone who points at a human being and says he's God? No, of course not. I am not a man is all over the Old Testament. But the problem is that what we do have in the Old Testament, and I'm like going off track and then we can have some questions, but what we do have in the Old Testament is this Melech Adonai or Melech Yahweh, the messenger of the Lord. And a lot of times this messenger appears and at the end of the episode, someone says, oh, we've seen God. It's not an angel anymore. All of a sudden they realize, oh, we saw God. We have seen the Lord. And then this happens with Manoah. Yeah. Manoah offers the sacrifice, and then the messenger goes up, and he turns to his wife and says, whoa, we've just seen the Lord. Like this wasn't just an angel. It was a physical manifestation of God. And so when this happens, you have this kind of like time period where people don't fully know who that was standing in front of them. And that, to me, that's about the time it takes for people to really start to like put together who this Jesus character was and why you have some silence in between his life and the first writings of the New Testament and the first biographies and all that. So anyhow, if there's any questions, I think now would be a good time, or anything that over the next couple of weeks you like, hey, could you talk about this? I tend to be an Old Testament person, but I'm fine with New Testament or non-Bible or whatever. And if we don't have any questions, that's fine too. Don't feel like you need to be put on the spot. So, anything at all? Nope. Okay, good. All right, so Finn, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to bore you. Since nobody has any questions about anything, Larry has some, but he doesn't like to ask them in front of people. Now, for the next 2 weeks, I think what we'll do is we will expand on some of this and get deeper into how to read our Bible a little more critically and a little more honestly. Because I think one of the most disrespectful things we can do is expect something which isn't perfect to be perfect. And if we'll learn to live with the Bible's imperfections without having to call them flaws necessarily, then I think we tend to do better with how we're interpreting all this. And, I say when I talk to people one-on-one that if the Bible could be figured out in a lifetime, it wouldn't be worth reading. And that's how I tend to feel about any sacred text. If you could really get your mind around everything they're saying, what's the point? There's no more wrestling, there's no more limp, there's no more value in it. If you know it, that's that. With science stuff, Kevin can tell you, like, you put two chemicals together and they're pretty much always going to do the same thing. It's not going to change. But with the Bible, and you open this thing up, and I only went into just a little tiny bit today, but there's dozens of ways every single verse can be looked at. And I think that if we're going to be good Christians, I used to say this Marcus Borg quote all the time, and it's a good quote. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's also kind of wrong. And he said, Jews find their decisive revelation of God in a book. And it's called the Torah, or the Tanakh, if we want to throw the whole Old Testament in. And Muslims find their definitive revelation of God in a book, and they call it the Quran. But for Christians, we're supposed to find our definitive revelation of God in a man, right? But where we find that man is in a book. And so no matter what we want to say about how, I'm not a biblicist, and at the end of the day, everything comes back to the Bible. Because that's where what does Jesus look like? Well, I don't know. Let's go to Matthew. How does Jesus respond to this issue? This issue? I don't know. Let's go see what he says in Luke. And we hearken back to, or Paul said, or, and it's like, even though we want to chuck it, we want to keep using it, and I don't think you get to do both. And I got no problem with proof texting as long as you're willing to work through what it actually says. Because that's a big problem, right? We love to proof text. But the problem is a lot of times when we read our proof texts, we don't read everything around it. We don't look into what the language actually says. We're not looking into if there's any ambiguity in it, if it's ever been taken as allegorical. There's a whole lot of stuff in the Old Testament that's taken as allegorical from long time ago that we still think is literal. Very, 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 very few Jewish rabbis believe that Joshua is historical. Very few. And very, 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 very few scholars of any breed believe that Job is historical. Job is a Babylonian play. They know this. And it's written in Hebrew and given Hebrew things, but there's also do we know anywhere in the Hebrew Bible other than Job that the Satan is able to just kind of approach God as a member of his court? No, only in Job. And that testifies to the way the Babylonian pantheon worked. The accuser is able to come talk to the God. He's just part of the thing, and then we branch off into what is Satan, and it's, throughout the Bible it changes. It's an office, it's an accuser, it's an adversary. Sometimes God creates a Satan in people's way, and it's an angel. That's the Satan. So it's the more we dive into this, the more we start to see, there's actual ancient Near Eastern custom in here. And there are things that are known plays, and there are things that again, I don't know any rabbi that I've talked to or read or any scholar that I've read that thinks that Jonah was meant to be taken literally. Do people exist alive for 3 days in digestive juices? No, they don't. They would die. But God kept him alive. I think that's a stretch. I think that probably what happened is Jonah was thrown overboard and the sea spit him out. That happens. People wash ashore. And guess what? He didn't die. How did he not die? God must have kept him alive in the belly of a fish. Does it mean that a man named Jonah never existed or preached to Nineveh? No, not necessarily. It just means, again, we've made fantastic some elements of the story to remember the point. That what's the point? That God loves Nineveh, who's part of Babylon. Oh, crap. That's not good. But we're so fixated on whether or not a dude can live for 3 days in the belly of a fish that we forget that God loves the privileged oppressor just like he does those they're oppressing. And then we can get into this applies to us today. Right? Because this is the language that we've got going on around us right now. Oppression is coming to the forefront, and abuse is coming to the forefront. And what we want to do, what we really want to do is say, no, you can't have mercy on Nineveh. You can only have mercy on those that they're oppressing, which is us. And God says, no. You don't get to tell me who I love. You don't get to tell me who I can have mercy on. But if we keep reading it flat, we're probably never going to see that, right? I could keep going for a while, but it's almost 12, so let's just wrap it up here. I think that's it. If you have any questions that you didn't want to ask, but you will privately, that's fine. And if you're online watching us, you can send me a message to my Facebook, and we'll deal with that. Otherwise, you're going to get a good dose of Jacques Derrida next week. Everybody's like, who? Exactly. How many of you have ever heard the word deconstruction as it relates to your faith? Yeah, and it's sad that you've all heard that word and don't know the name Jacques Derrida. So we'll go into some of his stuff too. You're dismissed.